Welcome, everyone. I'm Steve Saraboff. I'm the chair of the MIT Enterprise Forum of the Central Coast, and I want to welcome you to tonight's event. We are really excited about tonight's event. It's going to be a really great one. If you were with us last month, you'll know uh, last month with honestly, I think I'm just excited about all of our events. It's like a parent. Which child do you love the most? I love all of my children, and I love all of you for being here. And truly, I want to welcome everyone for joining us tonight. Um, and one of the things I want to invite everyone to is after tonight's event, we will have a really cool networking event. Um, Normally, when we are in person and live, we do networking at the beginning of our events. When we switched to virtual, we started running our networking at the end. And the cool part about networking at the end is it gives you an opportunity as the audience to interact directly with our panelists and with other people who are involved. And I think a bunch of our panelists will be hanging around in the networking event afterwards. Now, the networking is not run through Zoom. We have a different platform. It's called Appreciate Social. And if you watch the chat during tonight's event, there will be links to the Appreciate Social um, networking event afterwards. Super easy, click, in you go. If you're unsure about what it's like, well, think about what it was like for you before you ever tried Zoom. Oh, click, and in you go. Works great. Um, let's see. Tonight's event. Tonight's event is negative emissions and positive returns, climate change and economic opportunity. I am really excited as the chair of the board. I've really been enjoying watching this event come together. We have a really spectacular panel for you tonight. Um, let's see, I've touched on appreciate social. Here's something else is normally when we are live, we have food and we have a bar. Um, if anyone started tonight on time, there was a slide that was up with um, our sponsor information. And I'm going to buy, you know what, tonight, whoever identifies the grammar error in that slide through the Q&A option in Zoom tonight, I will buy you a drink at the bar tonight. And that brings me to another thing, Q&A. So Q&A, there is in your Zoom window a Q&A button. It should be right next to the chat button. If you have questions for our panelists, the way to share your questions with our panelists is through the Q&A. Don't share them through the chat. We won't be monitoring the chat the way we monitor Q&A, but we will monitor Q&A and pass the questions on to the panelists. So use that. Speaking of the slide with our sponsors, our premier sponsors are Bank of the West, Falver Large Archibald and Spray, Nassif Hicks Harris and Company, the Pacific Coast Business Times, SoCal IP Law Group LLP, Stradling, the Santa Barbara Independent, Chill Strategic Partners, Founders Capital Partners, hi Bob, and Ed Hat. And we have 9 more supporting sponsors, and we are very grateful for their support. If you are interested in becoming a sponsor of the MIT Enterprise Forum, the Central Coast, please reach out to us, and you can do that through our website, lots of different opportunities. I want to thank our sponsorship committee for handling all of that. Let me invite you to join us next month at our event, which will be on April 21, and we are consistently on the 3rd Wednesday of the month, as this one is. Next month's topic is property technology in the era of COVID. And property and technology are really cool things. And certainly for those of you who are working from home, who have moved to work from home, lots of questions. What's going to happen when we move back into the office, or are we moving back into the office? And from a bigger picture, what happens to all that real estate and what's going to happen to our office space? So turning to tonight's event about emissions, climate change, economic opportunities. The program tonight was produced by my fellow board members and friends, Renee Rotner and Kevin Parent. They are both really amazing people, and I truly thank them for their hard work. And you will, as an audience, come to appreciate what a wonderful panel they have put together. normally one of our producers will also be the moderator, but as a reflection of the great work and modesty of both Renee and Kevin, they chose to have an outsider be our moderator. And we are um, really honored tonight to have as the moderator for the panel James Temple. James Temple is a senior editor for energy and climate with the MIT Technology Review. And the MIT Technology Review is a sister organization of the MIT Enterprise Forum. So it's really cool for us to have James from MIT Technology Review participating tonight in that role. And if you are not familiar with the MIT Technology Review, it's a really fantastic magazine. Highly recommend it. I really love it. Really great. James covers clean energy, decarbonization, adaptation, and climate change. Previously, he was a senior director at The Verge. He was a deputy managing editor at Recode, and he has been the technology columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle. I am now going to hand things off to James, and I will return at the end to close things out and once again invite you to join us at the Appreciate Social for networking. James, hand it to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that kind introduction, and hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm excited to be here. I think we've got a really interesting set of panelists and a really important topic that we'll be discussing. That's because these two things are true at once. We need to draw down massive amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And at the moment, we're not that great at drawing down massive amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. A recent National Academy study found that to prevent 2 degrees C of warming, we'll need to remove 10 billion tons a year from the atmosphere by 2050 and 20 billions annually by 2100. By way of scale, the world pumps out about 50 billion tons a year today. So we're talking about a carbon removal industry operating on the emission scale of like half the global economy by the end of the century. Only it's harder to remove CO2 once it's been dispersed than it is to generate it in the first place. We are staring at this daunting scale because we've pumped out massive amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere for well over a century, because we've still done relatively little to decarbonize our economies to date, and because there's still some crucial missing pieces in our technological toolkits. Those include ways of affordably cleaning up sectors like aviation, cement, steel, agriculture. But to come back to my second point, there are really big challenges to doing things, doing carbon removal anywhere at this sort of scale for several reasons. First, our technological options like CO2 sucking machines, these direct air capture machines that are starting to be developed and starting to be deployed into the world, but it's a very nascent sector and it's also extremely expensive today. We're talking about expensive on the order of like $300, $400 a ton. On the other hand, we do know that our natural systems are really good at drawing down CO2. They do it naturally. It's part of the natural carbon cycle. Our forests do it, plants do it, soil, oceans, certain minerals, but they don't do it as fast as we need to do it because of how much faster we are accelerating our own emissions. And frankly, they face some big challenges so far in terms of not the physical capacity, but in terms of setting up the human systems required to accelerate and scale up these processes, figuring out ways to measure and verify that they're actually happening, ensuring that they're happening in at least a durable way, if not even better, a permanent one, and making sure that whatever efforts we're undertaking in certain parts of the world aren't being outpaced and effectively unraveled by other people or parties accelerating, say, timber harvesting or deforestation somewhere else in the world. And unfortunately, the variety of carbon offset systems based on these natural solutions to date have faced some real serious challenges in our initial attempts to make them work. When researchers and journalists have taken a hard look at how they're performing on the ground, it often appears that they can inflate reductions in certain circumstances. They can even create perverse incentives that lead to additional deforestation or greater emissions in certain ways. And so all of these things are starting to matter a lot more, and I've started to cover these issues a lot more for a few reasons. One is that we're starting to see more and more countries talk about carbon removal and offsets as a key part of their mid-century-ish net zero plans. They want to, cut emissions as much as possible, but pretty much everyone is still relying on some major element of carbon removal to get to where we need to be to avoid really, really dangerous warming levels. Surprisingly rapidly rising number of major companies now, just in the past, even if just last 18 months or so, are looking to various types of avoided emissions, carbon removal, offset strategies to slash their carbon footprints. And we're seeing rapidly growing carbon markets with all sorts of third-party verifiers, brokers, market operators emerging. And several crucial issues spring from all this. First, given that more and more companies and countries are relying on these tools for major parts of the decarbonization and net zero efforts, it's just going to become that much more important that we're doing things right, that these are efforts that these carbon removal efforts are real and reliable and measurable and durable to permanent. Second, there's likely to be a limited supply of actually quality, credible offsets and ways of doing carbon removal. So we really can't afford for companies and countries to rely on them for the things that we do know how to clean up. So even if doing the root causes is a more expensive process for them, there's a real risk here that people and countries will opt to do forms of carbon removal on paper in lieu of the harder work of cutting emissions. And clearly, given what I said at the beginning about these projections, we need to do all of these things. Third, from a global fairness perspective, to the degree that there is sort of a limited supply of these things, arguably you could make the sort of moral case that they should be reserved not for giant profitable companies in rich nations, but rather thought of as more of a buffer for poor nations that aren't as far along in development and may have to rely on fossil fuels for longer periods than the rest of the world before they kind of get to that point of economic development where they can make those shifts and where the cost of renewables and other clean options are coming down. And fourth, as more and more players come to profit from these building carbon markets, whether it's voluntary or government-based offsets programs, it's going to get harder, not easier, to enact reforms when it becomes clear that there are problems with it. So this is something I think is really important, is that it's going to be crucial that we do the work today to talk about these things in an open and honest and constructive way, and be open to feedback and criticism when it appears these programs and systems aren't working as well as hoped or at all. And sorry if that was too much, but so today we're fortunate to have a panel of 4 people, each of whom are working in one way or another on these challenges, on figuring out how to do carbon removal or negative emissions, either directly creating markets or tools or funding startups in this realm. And I'm going to introduce them one at a time here. We're going to start with Clea Kolster. She is the Director of Science at Lower Carbon Capital, which is a venture firm focused on startups developing ways both to slash emissions and to suck up carbon. She leads the firm's research, development, and diligence efforts. So welcome, Clea, and please tell us a little bit more about what you and Lower Carbon Capital are working on these days, and why this is such an important problem for you.
Thank you, James. Yeah, hi everyone, great to be here. Just a caveat that if you lose me, that's because I've lost internet connection, but hopefully I will be on for the whole time. So Lower Carbon Capital, we invest in early stage companies that do a number of things, but one, reduce emissions from point sources by a substantial amount. I want to emphasize that we're laser focused on the chunks of the economy that are really a big pie of greenhouse gas emissions, and I'll note some examples of that. Secondly, we invest in companies that remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and so that's companies like Maddie's that she'll get a chance to talk about, that do it from a nature-based standpoint. We call generally nature-based solutions, as well as tech-based solutions, direct air capture, biomass gasification. We can talk about all of those later, but and then tools that enable those two to take place. So whether that's it's carbon accounting, like with I think we'll hear from Landon, who does great work there, and Gregory, as well as monitoring of CO2 emissions. Those are important tools in understanding the way the 1 and 2 fit into the general greenhouse gas emissions landscape. And then the third thing that we focus time on is on better understanding how, if we don't do 1 and 2 fast enough, we would have to essentially buy more time or find ways in which humanity can be comfortable in the warming state that it will be in. It's a bit of a dire a dire intro, but ultimately, from the negative emissions standpoint, we firmly, we see the need to reduce our emissions. We need to do that as fast as we possibly can. But the reality is that we have emitted so much greenhouse gases that we will also need to remove CO2 today and in the future. And that's critical to be able to, live comfortably, live humanly, to be able to do the things that we want to do, but mainly for, I think, in large parts of the Southern Hemisphere, are going to be in states that are generally very uncomfortable if we don't reduce the atmospheric concentration of CO2 at this point. So in terms of I would just want to highlight some of the kinds of things that we invest in that are very big chunks of that contribute to very big chunks of greenhouse gases that are emitted today, and those include, clean steel, decarbonizing cement, fertilizer, aviation, and maritime transport. Those make up, I think, altogether some 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, and then in terms of just briefly where I come from, my background is in chemical engineering. I've been wanting to focus on working on climate change solutions for over 10 years now. I did a PhD focused on carbon capture and storage systems, which has been particularly important in understanding the way that certain emissions can be removed from or reduced from point sources. Things like steel and cement plants that have few but a growing number of options to decarbonize. And I was fortunate enough to then work at a consulting firm called E3 in the Bay Area, where I got a chance to see from a policy standpoint really what it meant to set out plans for deep decarbonization. And then joined the lower carbon capital team last year, and it's been a really exciting time to see more and more companies come forward with really groundbreaking solutions to just better products generally, but also products that are better for the environment. Yeah, I think I'll stop there and go on to the next.
Great, thank you for that. And next up we have Landon Brand, who is co-founder and CEO of Wren, which primarily helps consumers calculate their climate footprint and offset some of their emissions or otherwise do some good in the world by providing money for tree planting efforts, Amazon deforestation projects, or clean cooking fuels for refugees in northern Uganda. I think at least one option is to do this on like a monthly subscription basis. So welcome, Landon. Please tell us more about how Wren works and why you've come to work on this problem.
Thanks, James. Hey, everyone. I'm Landon from Wren. We're a website that lets you calculate and offset your carbon footprint, like James was saying. Basically, it works by asking you a few questions about your lifestyle, like how much you drive, how much you fly, that sort of thing. And then we tell you how many tons of CO2 you're responsible for from that lifestyle. And then we make it easy for you to offset that CO2 by funding projects that plant trees, protect rainforest, or otherwise reduce and remove emissions. I started Wren in 2018 when my co-founders and I were in college. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had around this time just published a major report that basically summarized how bad the impacts of climate change could get and how critical it is that we limit warming and that we do it ASAP. For my co-founders and I, it was a bit of a wake-up call. We knew that climate change was a huge problem, but it felt like something that someone else would fix. And so we read this paper and kind of realized like, whoa, things are really bad. And we felt a lot of like existential angst around like, oh my gosh, what are we gonna do? Like, we're just like, we need way more action. It just doesn't seem to be happening. Felt pretty powerless in the moment. Luckily, we channeled this stress into finding solutions, and we came across this amazing resource called Project Drawdown that listed 100 solutions to the climate crisis that, if accomplished all at once, would get us to the point where we were pulling down more CO2 than we were emitting. And these solutions were ready to go today. They weren't relying on brand new technology. They just needed funding to scale up. So we figured we'd just build a site to crowdfund all these solutions to climate change. We also wanted people to understand the impact of their own daily life. So we built a tool to calculate your carbon footprint. And then we launched in June of 2019 and have been iterating on it ever since. James touched on this a bit, but I want to add a little bit more on carbon offset projects. So those are the projects that you fund on REN, and I think they're relevant to the discussion tonight. Carbon offset projects have some well-defined, measurable mechanism of reducing CO2 in the atmosphere, like planting trees or destroying refrigerant emissions, or even using machines that are sucking carbon out of the sky. So the carbon offset market has existed for a few decades, mostly thanks to purchases by big corporations to claim they're carbon neutral or under some policy set emissions target. But as James was talking about, the market's often criticized for how ineffective a lot of these offsets are. One kind of striking example here might be if someone purchases a forest to protect it, when in reality, the forest was never at risk of getting cut down. If someone else had bought it, they would have kept the forest standing as well. So there's lots of sort of loopholes or challenges like that when it comes to carbon offsets. So even though there's this existing market, we have to figure out what the future of that market looks like if we want to scale it up. And put another way, there's a lot of the solutions that we need to end the climate crisis are kind of ready to go today. There's a clear market incentive. So for solar panels and electric cars, those are going to reach mainstream adoption pretty easily at this point. Policy can help a ton, but they don't need this financial incentive to kickstart at this point. But for tree planting at scale or lots of negative emissions technologies, we aren't really there yet. We kind of need more robust markets that are going to fund and kickstart these projects. So with REN, the idea is that regular people can help kickstart these markets and fund the most effective, transparent carbon offset and negative emissions techniques. So we can hopefully start scaling this up to eventually reach a point where we're removing gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere. Really looking forward to the discussion tonight. I think the other speakers are working on tools to make the space more transparent and more effective. And that's kind of exactly what we need. We need more reliable and effective ways to get carbon out of the atmosphere and prevent it from reaching the atmosphere in the first place. So thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Landon. And next up, we have Maddie Hall, who is co-founder and chief executive of Living Carbon, which is a startup funded by Lower Carbon Capital that's engineering trees that can grow faster and suck up more CO2. I've heard of genetic engineering plants for the purpose of more climate adaptation goals. So making plants that are more resilient to, drought conditions, flooding, things like that. I don't think I had heard before of like a plant engineering for carbon removal play. So I think this is really interesting. So yeah, welcome, Maddie. Please tell us a little bit more about what you guys are working on and how you sort of came into this problem and this approach.
Thanks, James. So as Landon's working on the carbon marketplace side and CLIA is of course funding, we're actually working on the supply side of carbon capture. So what that means to us is actually taking a first principles approach. So what if instead of planting 1 trillion trees, you could only have to plant 500 billion trees. And you could do so in a way that created economic incentives in the existing market of forestry, which is about $60 billion globally annually. So for Living Carbon, our mission is to responsibly rebalance the carbon flux using the unique technical abilities of humans. And we do this using the ability of plants to capture carbon. So every organism since the beginning of time within the plant family has been able to photosynthesize. And we specifically focus on developing technology that improves both the carbon capture and the duration of storage. And as James mentioned, historically, we've really used genetic engineering to improve yield for humans' own consumption, which is actually, if you think about it, the opposite of sequestration. all of the food that we eat ends up being part of respiration. And so we believe that humans need to start seeing ourselves as part of this global ecosystem and not purely here just to use our technology to benefit in isolation from it. There are many different ways to remove a lot of carbon from the atmosphere, ranging from spraying sulfuric acid to block out the sun, which is not technically carbon removal, but and putting genetically engineered microbes into the oceans, as well as many other more extreme geoengineering ideas. We believe that out of all of those things, trees are relatively safe. They're not going to get up and run away, and you can do it in a way that's a closed ecosystem. And our hope is that Living Carbon's seedlings, we focus on two things right now. The first is improving photosynthetic efficiency. So this is basically taking a toxic byproduct of photorespiration and breaking it down with less energy. And the second is slowing the rate of fungal decomposition of trees. So this results in more durable wood. One is a lot easier to measure over time than the other, and I'm happy to dig more into that. And yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have. A bit on my background, I used to focus on artificial intelligence at OpenAI and was seeing all of these people doing tons of work on AI and preparing for AI risk and artificial general intelligence, and really seeing that a lot of the lessons that we learned there could be applied to work on really ambitious projects related to carbon removal. And so was in a position to start that a couple of years ago, and now we're a team of all scientists, aside from myself, based out of San Francisco and also South Carolina.
Great, thank you, Maddie. And finally, we have Gregory Landau, co-founder and chief regeneration officer at Regen Network. Regen Network is using remote sensing like satellites and blockchain in an effort to improve the reliability of soil carbon and other nature-based projects. Microsoft recently invested in several of their soil carbon projects in Australia as part of its effort to cancel its entire historic emissions, which is one of the bolder, more ambitious carbon removal efforts underway at the corporate level today. So Gregory, please tell us a little bit more about how Regen Network is approaching this problem.
All right. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks, James, for that introduction, and thanks to all the other panelists for all their good work in the world. It's really an honor to be here. Yeah, so Regen Network, we have a couple, I want to share a couple of our assumptions about sort of foundational assumptions about this complex emergent issue that we're talking about here, climate. So number one, our assumption is that the Earth has full capability to, within its own, living carbon cycle, sequester 100% of the carbon that's been emitted since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Soils, forests, kelp forests, coral reefs, mangroves, estuaries, wetlands have enormous carbon sequestration capability. The question is really social. The question is about the humans and how we interact with those living systems. And if there's no good word in English for like working lands, right? We talk about agriculture and forest and forestry and fisheries in a way as if they're somehow fundamentally different. But the pattern of a human relationship with an ecosystem in which we're taking something that's produced by photosynthesis at the end of the day and consuming it for food, fuel, or fiber, that relationship, that fundamental relationship between humans and the greater than human world is really what needs to be examined. And as Landon mentioned, Project Drawdown, amazing resource. Many friends who are part of the group that put together the research there, and all of the solutions exist, right? So from our perspective, and again, I'm sort of sharing some of our assumptions. Our assumption is really this is sort of a social and economic question at the end of the day. How do we change our the economic conditions such that it is more profitable to operate a business that over time increases the sequestration rate of that soil, instead of stripping that soil of its soil carbon year after year after year through whatever the agricultural practice is, tillage, for instance. What does it mean for a living biodiverse forest to be worth more standing than it does being pulped for toilet paper? What does it mean for the incentives at a systemic level to transform so that we can unlock entrepreneurship and agency and investment in order for this, problem essentially to solve itself? And when we ask that question, the answer that emerges to us is we have to have a rigorous public infrastructure that makes it very cheap and very transparent to create claims around what in economic theory is referred to as a public good. It's hard to privatize, it's hard to commodify. We're talking about the sequestration potential of a parcel of land. How do you create economic agreements about that? And it all boils down to who is saying what about where, using what methodology, and creating rigor and transparency around that core question, and then scaling that to be able to create different economic agreements, derivative projects, products, bonds, credits. All of these instruments are the way that we contract with one another and align our incentives. And there's a whole world there, I believe, that's in the process of becoming. So my parting thought is, really, we're at, because we have to be, we are not now within the next 3 years at peak emissions, and we're at peak, atmospheric carbon. So we're now going to start the decline. And so what that means for entrepreneurs is there is more atmospheric carbon right now to capture through photosynthesis or direct air capture or any of the other methods than there will be in the future of humanity. So get busy if you want, because now is the time to start drawing that down, capturing it, storing it, sequestering it, because it's going to get harder and harder and scarcer. That carbon there's never going to be more than there is now. So now is the time to start moving and shaking.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for those presentations. So now we're going to go into a sort of Q&A session where I'm going to ask each of you a few more specific questions about some of the things you're working on. Clea, to start with you, I'm curious how Lower Carbon Capital thinks about the negative emission space from a investment perspective. For one thing, there are, as I was sort of saying at the beginning, there's kind of a wide variety of quality when it comes to the things that people are working on. There's a separate layer of, honestly, I think there are going to be some, perfectly profitable businesses that probably aren't actually, achieving the sorts of emissions reductions they want. So I'm curious, what are you looking for in a project or in a startup working in the negative emission space that you're going to want to invest in, and how do you balance the sort of likelihood that they're going to really make a dent and achieve real reductions versus what are the potentially more profitable and financially promising investment opportunities in this space?
Can you just clarify your last point in terms of what you would think are, you want me to talk about a comparison between those that would be more financially lucrative and less financially lucrative?
Yeah, I'm just asking, I'm curious about, in general, as you guys are surveying the space, a lot of startups are emerging suddenly in this world. What are the things that are going to pop out to you as being, a promising investment? And, would you make an investment into a company that looked like it's going to make a lot of money, but whether it's actual carbon removal is even if its actual carbon removal potential looks a little less credible, for instance?
So I'd probably say the answer to that one is no. We're looking to make investments in solutions that can materially, like I said, materially reduce emissions or remove greenhouse gas emissions, or remove greenhouse gas rather from the atmosphere or the oceans. So in terms of the way that we think about it, I mentioned this in my intro, but essentially we need we need to reduce our emissions by as much as we possibly can. We all know that, I think, hopefully. But the problem is, even beyond that, we're currently at a concentration level of CO2 that is higher than what we can stay at to maintain a livable and equitable environment. So we need negative emissions today, and we're going to need more in the future. That's not to say that we don't need to put all of our efforts, or a large chunk of our efforts, into reducing emissions. So essentially, the way that lower carbon capital sees it is either we have a wide variety of solutions that can remove CO2 from the atmosphere and from our oceans, or we're not in a good place, just environmentally, fundamentally, earthwise. And I mean, it's obvious, or it's becoming increasingly obvious in the Northern Hemisphere. I think, we see it in California. It's last summer was a very, COVID plus the fires was a very sad time. We saw it very recently in Texas. And we're going to see it increasingly in our Northern Hemisphere, and we see it even more acutely in the Southern Hemisphere. So that's just putting context into how we see this. And I think, there have been studies that have kind of put together an estimate of what the size of this market will be in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And those estimates, pin CO negative emissions and carbon removal at more than $1 trillion industry. Essentially, the value of the oil and gas industry today. So in terms of what we want to see in a company that is able to provide negative emissions, we invest in both nature-based solutions and tech-based solutions. Nature-based solutions are critical because we can set those up in a very large scale. They have a bunch of biodiversity implications that are critical to restore our environment. And I think increasingly we are able to develop the tools required to monitor the nature-based solutions in a way that we couldn't before, and in a way that I think there was a time where people considered planting a tree as wishy-washy because nobody was monitoring that tree would stay there, and that it was sucking up a certain amount of CO2. So that's one. And then on the tech-based solutions, I mean, it's challenging because direct air capture is probably the least efficient way of removing CO2. Better to have gotten it before it went into the atmosphere in the first place. But like I said, we need negative emissions, and there's going to be I think there's just going to be a suite of negative emissions requirements that will be allocated to the tech-based solutions that can be monitored potentially in a way that some might consider differently from the way that nature-based solutions are. There are a lot of exciting things happening on the tech-based side. What we look for is a solution that can be scalable, that has a clear pathway to reducing cost. Like you said, currently tech-based solutions are pretty expensive. They're at the $300 to $600 per ton of CO2 range, but we've made a number of investments that are very exciting, and I'm pretty sure that there will be more, but in things like in companies like Carbon Engineering that have a clear pathway down to less than $200 per ton of CO2. Some newer companies like Noya Labs that is looking at retrofitting cooling towers in a way that can substantially reduce the capital requirement around direct air capture. Charm Industrial that's looking at biomass waste, of which we have a lot in the US, and I think using biomass waste is not necessarily the solution for all regions, but there are definitely a lot of continents where there's enough biomass waste to get negative emissions from, as well as potentially produce byproducts that are of high value to a number of industries that we can get into, whether that's synthetic fuels or direct reduction of iron ore. And then monitoring and the ability to monitor the long-term sequestration of carbon. I mean, that's critical both for nature-based and tech-based. And there have been so many exciting companies that have come up and that we've gotten a chance to invest in. And I'm sure that there's going to be more that are able to tick all of those boxes. Now, I think that's the main lesson around venture capital is that, you'll always make mistakes, or not everything can work out, but I'm pretty confident that a lot of our portfolio right now is looking really great in that respect. And I'm sure there are many that I'm missing, but I think that gives you a good idea and a good sense of the way that we're looking at things right now.
Right. And you mentioned the challenge of kind of scaling up and driving down the cost on the direct air capture side. And I think I mentioned it's like 300-400 today. I think David Keith, who's the founder even of Carbon Engineering, has done some of the science. They think they can get at full scale like 100-ish. How do you see that unfolding? Like in terms of I think one of the challenges with that particular market are those early entry markets, because CO2 is a commodity product. And so when it's that expensive, how do you get the ball rolling so that you can get to the point where you're driving down the cost, scaling up these facilities and driving down those costs? How do you see that part of it unfolding?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a challenge, right, in the past few decades, but I think that we're seeing the tides turn from a policy standpoint, but also from a corporate standpoint. I think just a couple of days ago, the U.S. Congress is going to pass or something like going to sign a bill around $5 billion for CO2 transportation and storage infrastructure, which is very exciting. I mean, that being able to drive down that cost and have large scale CO2 carbon dioxide logistics is an important feature of that. And then from the corporation side, I mean, we have these mega corporations that have been created and that are doing us a lot of good and maybe some bad, but for the most part, they've also realized that they have a pretty strong social imperative to mind their environmental impact. And for some of those, that not only means their future emissions, but also looking retroactively at their emissions, like Microsoft has made a pretty public stance on doing. And so all of those things combined, you also have, you have a number of smaller but growing markets like the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which essentially, the cap on that is at $200 per ton. So if you can get carbon removal at less than that, then you're in the money. You have 45Q that will provide $50 per ton of CO2 permanently sequestered, and a little bit less if you're using that for EOR. And then generally, I mean, there's the sequestration part, but there's also I think a growing beachhead market for CO2. I mean, you mentioned CO2 is a commodity today. There are about 200 million tons of CO2 that's traded broadly globally, but there's a lot of very exciting innovation around CO2 utilization as well. In industries that are worth like hundreds of billions of dollars, whether that's concrete, cement, CO2 for synthetic fuel production. If you want to go down that route, but then aviation or shipping, there are a lot of markets that are increasingly going to be scrutinized and are already scrutinized, that for which CO2 can be a valuable input product, and hopefully drive those costs down for plants like Carbon Engineering's and others to go down the cost curve.
Great, got it. I want to apologize. I'm trying to mute as much as possible because my neighbor's dog is suddenly barking a lot, which sometimes triggers my dog to start whining and barking back. So that part hasn't happened yet. We'll hope to.
No worries.
These are the realities of working remotely in a pandemic. We're all doing the best we can. Hey, Landon. So I want to start with I know you're working in several areas in terms of offsets. I want to talk a little bit more about the tree planting side of it. Everyone loves trees. It's pretty, the one thing we all know is that they suck in CO2 and breathe out oxygen. So it's promising, it seems promising and straightforward. But there have been challenges in on the ground reality with afforestation in reforestation projects in the past. There was a Stanford study last year that found that Chile's earlier efforts to subsidize tree planting ended up incentivizing the replacement of native forests with tree plantations, which actually reduced biodiversity and at least didn't increase carbon uptake. And then there was just a Bloomberg story last week or the week before that concluded a similar kind of perverse incentive problem had happened, had taken root in the Sowing Life reforestation program in Mexico. So I was curious if these, if REN is taking steps to ensure like the tree planting projects aren't coming at the cost of native forests and running into some of these sorts of problems in its East Africa project or wherever else you guys are working on tree planting projects.
Yeah, great question. So like we were talking about earlier, there's been this history of the carbon offset market for a while now, and there's been a lot of high profile, just like basically disasters where project is supposed to be doing one thing, like maybe protecting rainforest here, and then you do an analysis later and it's like, oh my God, there was a ton of illegal logging here. There was a ton of wildfires rolling through. So definitely you have to look at all of these projects, really have to scrutinize it. Like there's third-party kind of standards that verify the projects are working and do great work in that aspect, but even the standards that are popular today, we don't have the confidence that we want to see to be able to just rely on one standard. So I think that's why folks like, I think Gregory's basically doing a lot of work in this space to make it so we can maybe have some standards we can trust a lot more. And yeah, anyway, to return to your original question a bit more, there's basically like a checklist of stuff you want to check off when it comes to tree planting projects. Certainly one of them is they have to be planting either native species or species that are going to do well and provide helpful benefits for that area, like nothing that's especially vulnerable to pests or more likely to burn or going to cause some ecosystem damage. The specific project in East Africa is kind of interesting that you mentioned, James. They're basically funding subsistence farmers to grow trees on their land. And often that means planting trees that are providing other benefits like growing fruit or providing shade or kind of windbreaks at helpful areas. That's another way we can maybe have a bit more, ensure that these trees are staying standing, is by making them valuable in the work that they're doing for the people who live in the area. Another potential issue I'll touch on here too is land ownership. So you can imagine one awesome group owns a piece of land and they're planting a bunch of trees. It's going really great. And then eventually 20 years in or something, they run out of money, something happens, that land changes hands. All of a sudden, next landowner is going to cut down all those trees. So not a good scenario for that carbon offset project. One of the solutions we're seeing emerge for one of the projects we fund in the United Kingdom is putting land into kind of like a long-term trust or covenant that ensures beyond the company's longevity that the future landowners will still have that trees growing. So in some countries that won't work, like areas where there's a weaker rule of law, you can't have that guarantee of legal instruments that are enforced by a government like the UK or US. But in countries where you do have strong rule of law, that's maybe one other helpful solution here. And the last thing I'd say is anytime you're planning these projects that are kind of nature-based solutions, you always have to think about what is our risk profile here? How likely is it that this is going to reverse, that something is going to go wrong and the carbon's going to be emitted again?
Right.
And for that, most commonly what people do is they say, we're going to overcompensate by 10% or 20%, or depends on the risk profile. And then for whenever on aggregate, like some of these projects go a little bit wrong, that buffer is there to make sure we're offsetting how much we wanted to offset.
Got it. How are you measuring and verifying what's being planted under what conditions and how much carbon removal is taking place on the ground? Are you relying on sort of some of the existing protocols from the registries, or have you developed your own systems? How does that sort of ground truth process part of this work for you guys?
Yeah, we do a mix. So the existing registries are helpful, and we usually lean towards projects that are on existing registries, just because they already do a bunch of the sort of auditing, ground truth measurement that we want to do. But we found that it's just not enough, especially because on Wren, we have this particular challenge too of wanting to convey that the project is happening and successful to a person who's browsing our website for like 5 minutes. We can't be on like a sales call with Microsoft explaining how great it is and have them visit the site and do all this work. So one of the things we found to be effective here is only working with projects that, first of all, are super transparent, publishing all documentation publicly, so any sort of auditing they do should be available. And then ideally are publishing like photos of every tree planted and growing, tied with GPS coordinates, tied with measurements of those tree trunks every 18 months or so. Lots of times satellite imagery is really helpful with sort of painting the picture and just having a better perspective on what's going on with these projects. So there's a huge element of transparency that's really important here.
Got it. Cool. Maddie, so I haven't done a ton of coverage in the past of the sort of plant genetic issues, but the one thing I know about it is it's hard. that from isolating the particular genetic sequence that's at work in terms of producing the positive thing that you want, to ensuring that whatever changes you do make aren't coming at the cost of other critical functions. And I'm also guessing that, I don't know exactly where you are in the development space or how much you're able to say about where you're at in the development space, but just based on how long the company's been around, I'm guessing you don't have like fully engineered trees that are like full maturity yet. So I guess I'm curious if there's still some science and development risk here that, whatever you have achieved may come at the cost, like, I'm just imagining like trees that don't have the root system to support the greater size we're talking about, or the more rapid growth, or they end up needing 4x the water, or certain types of soil. I don't know, but can you just talk about sort of what kind of like scientific risks you may have, and how you guys are sort of dealing with that?
Yeah, of course. So I think Living Carbon, we really stand on the backs of giants, people that have been working within the forest biotechnology space for 20, 30 years, who do have mature tree stands. So we're able to learn a lot from them. So our first demonstration forest with Oregon State University, one of the professors there has been doing this, for as long as I've been alive. And I think one thing that we think a lot about is just measuring all of the ecological considerations and very thoroughly understanding from a biochemical perspective exactly what's happening, right? So a lot of people focus on modifying Rubisco, which is the most famous enzyme in the world. And a lot of those efforts have not been very successful, just because the enzyme itself denatures very quickly, and it's just incredibly challenging to modify. So we actually rely a lot on work that's been done in crops previously. So the similar pathways have been used in tobacco, in soy. Nothing has really made it to market yet, but the science has really been something that's been worked on, for a very long time by multiple institutions. So for us, we actually see, when it comes to root growth is a lot faster and more complex and robust if you have a photosynthesis enhanced seedling. Of course, there are other considerations, but I think you have to make sure that you are understanding the fundamental biochemistry around how you're changing and the genetic modification that you're making, and how you're changing the way in which the plant is capturing carbon. So, and then the other thing that I'll add here is, we have been around for a short period of time. There have been other companies, particularly around biofuel, that have worked a lot on reducing the cellulose to lignin ratio as a means of improving biochar, or the ability to use poplar seedlings to, make biofuels. And unfortunately, that's less of a market right now, but we rely a lot on the protocols that have been used since the early 2000s on how to do that. And, I think for genetic engineering and gene editing itself, of course, it's incredibly challenging. The way I like to think about it is we're doing something that has not been done before. And so we have had to find people that have done specific parts of this thing and know how to do specific parts of that thing. And then combined together, we can hopefully, create these seedlings. And we're really excited to have them planted shortly. I can't say much more about that, unfortunately, but as a hard science company, one thing that's important to me is that we don't focus on announcing funding. We don't focus on PR for the sake of PR. We specifically focus on announcing our progress and our proof of concept development, and doing a lot of education and outreach to organizations ranging from high school students to conservation communities, because those are the people that, in our opinion, really matter. No offense, James. But yeah, and I think there's new technology like CRISPR, which is something that we utilize that allows for much more nuance in terms of the different changes that you can make. And all of the genes that we use come from other trees. So something that we're very confident won't have as many implications and off-site and off-target effects that you might see if you're doing a herbicide-resistant crop or something of the like.
And I realize you guys have just sort of recently come out of stealth mode, if that's the right phrase for it. And so, I don't know how much you are not able to talk about, but can you discuss the kind of go-to-market strategy? Like where do you think these things will be growing in the world? Are we mixing these in with, natural forests, or are these going to be like, isolated tree plantations onto their own? And what's the business model or models? How do you think you're going to get money? Is it selling negative emissions offsets? Is it selling half of it to timber companies? Sorry, I'm asking like 18 questions there, but
no worries. So I think I'll address a couple things. One is where are we planting these seedlings, how, whom, and that side of it. And the other side is how do we become a business that's actually able to generate revenue. And so we specifically focus on managed land and land that is degraded or previously clear cut. Pasture land as well is of interest to us. In addition, agroforestry. So agroforestry has been shown to improve the amount of milk that you're getting from your cattle by about 25% on the hottest days and on the coolest days. So we're not trying to replace any land that's currently naturally reforesting itself. We specifically focus on these marginalized lands, which actually, if you do a lot of research, I think the Nature Conservancy, as well as the American Family Forest Foundation, they have a really great hub that you can look and you can actually see the breakdown. And I believe it's like 180 million hectares of unforested land is within that managed pasture land category. So for us, we see our rollout kind of similar to Impossible Foods. So initially, to start, we have flagship groups of timber landowners and pasture landowners that get access to our seedlings at no cost. And the way in which we do that is, the margins on nurseries are not that great. So it's not in our best interest to be trying to make a premium profit on selling seedlings. And we actually act as a carbon project developer ourselves. So one way to eliminate some of the issues that you see with the inability to account for carbon credits and the leakage that you see is actually because there are just so many different parties involved in the process. You of course need a third-party verification organization, and we plan to do that for our carbon projects as well. But yeah, so our model is basically we reserve the rights to the carbon offsets, and then we're able to sell those to large corporations for purchasing. And one thing that's interesting that I just want to clarify, that there's a lot of misconceptions that sustainable harvesting of trees is bad for carbon capture, but actually harvested wood is stored carbon, right? And in a lot of cases, by just letting the tree stands stay there and decompose naturally, they're not being used for useful products. So if you can ensure that either your wood is more durable and decomposes slower, or is used for things like the floor that I'm looking at right now, that actually has a higher likelihood of storing that carbon for longer than if the tree just naturally decomposes on its own and releases all the CO2 that it captured back into the atmosphere. So for us, our landowners have to agree to certain practices like coppicing, and that allows for the root growth to continue even when the timber portion is actually harvested for useful products, and they can't be used for pulp or paper.
That's what I was gonna say, it depends on the end use, right? I mean, if it's like a
Yes.
it's like a wood cabinet that's gonna live, in my home for 100 years, then
Yeah.
great. If it's paper products or whatever, then yeah, that can go back up pretty quickly, I think, is my opinion.
Totally. And, just like the contracts that the landowners that Landon works with, or Gregory, there are different stipulations that you have to agree to in terms of how those end products are used. But what's really great about our business model is we don't cut into the timber revenue or any additional revenue that the landowners would have. A lot of organizations will take a big cut of that. And for us, we're able to rely specifically on the carbon markets and the connections that we have there.
Right. Okay. Time is going much faster than I thought, and I have so many more questions for everyone. But let's go to Gregory. I did a story about soil carbon a while back, and I talked to a number of soil scientists and others, and there are a number of concerns about not that there isn't a lot of physical capacity to do this, but that soil science is sort of still, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how much additional how much additional carbon is actually being taken up through, under what techniques, under what conditions, under what climate conditions, soil types, depths, etc. And so there's very much a strong feeling among the folks that I talk to is that you really have to do a lot of sampling to know. And the other thing that came out of those conversations is that our ability to use satellites to accurately measure soil carbon is not, there's not a lot of science that says that that's an easy thing to do. And that seems to be a big component of your company and your approach. So can you talk about why you're confident that you guys have figured out a way to do this, and otherwise how you're sort of getting around the challenge of this, just the variability of carbon uptake in soil from place to place, time to time, drought condition to the following season, etc.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of points here. So point number one is, I think that one is we have to ask, sort of ask about the underlying incentives of the critics. So there was recently like a lot of sort of a flurry of criticism from a certain well-regarded sort of science NGO, who at this moment shall go unnamed. They had a lot of interest in forestry-based credits. Okay, so just flagging that we just, not to, like, I'm not trying to throw shade, I'm just trying to say we have to look at the larger structure, because this is it's about science, right? It's about having replicable, peer-reviewed scientific processes underpinning what's happening. And science is also run by people, and people undermine each other's science for different economic concerns. So just like to pin that as something that I think is really important to talk about in this concept about how we create social consensus about what is actually happening somewhere, that people aren't going to go look at that soil, right? So sort of point number one. Point number two, there is a dearth of good science that is using remote sensing combined with soil samples. It's just, there's just hasn't been a whole lot of departments that are well endowed to do a lot of studies. What I can say is all of the studies that are coming out, there's been a bunch of them in the last year, are all like right on the money, trending with the same sort of conclusions, which and those conclusions are that combining sampling and remote sensing increases the precision and accuracy of our modeling and estimations of soil carbon sequestration. So it's really about combining the two. In addition to that, using remote sensing, you can what's called stratify the sample set. So you can, instead of having like a random grid where you're just sampling every 10 meters or every 20 meters or something, you can actually stratify for topography, soil type, and you basically create a layer, and you can ensure that you're getting samples from all of the important sort of subcategories across a landscape. And that massively increases the efficiency of monitoring, verification, and quantification. And essentially that's what we're doing, underpinning our approach. And it's not just us, there's a whole community of people who are now sort of approaching this using either Sentinel-2 data or which is published by the European Space Agency, which gives us a global refresh every 5 days of the entire planet, right? With 13 bands of spectral imagery. And what people need to understand about sort of multi-spectral remote sensing is we are measuring. It's a measurement. We're just like a microscope, electron microscope is a system for measurement. So what are we measuring? We're measuring the reflectivity, and we're correlating that to the ground samples, right? And so in a very simple way, you could conceptualize what's taking place as, how green is the plant, or how dark is the earth, and how does that correlate to the laboratory samples that did bulk density or soil organic carbon quantification. Now, there is a whole universe of even labs have uncertainty. So what I think is what we think is really important on the science side is to be radically transparent about uncertainty and quantify uncertainty, because as Landon was talking about, in sort of the quantification and monetization of living carbon, in soil or a tree or what have you, there's always going to be a set of risks. There's permanence risks around drought or fire. There's monitoring and quantification risks around uncertainty, right? You may have, it's all probabilistic, right? So there's a set of risks, quantifying those, and then ensuring that you have very conservative buffer pools, so that if there's a drought or there's a fire, or you had some statistical anomalies in the landscape that you're monitoring that led you to overestimate your carbon, you need to just be setting aside enough sort of the reserve that you're claiming is being sequestered in order to make both parties whole in the agreement, the buyer and the seller. And that's where the quantification of that uncertainty is really the name of the game, right? It isn't about having 100% accuracy. That'll never happen. It's about being able to say, given this, these statistical models, this machine learning, this, regression algorithm, and these soil samples, we can say with 85% certainty that this is the soil organic carbon in this specific place, and that can be verified and replicated. Good science, other scientists can come, they can look at the data and look at the methodology and come to the same result and say, yep, we come up with the same level of certainty, right? Yeah. And that's what relates to how much carbon can actually go into the market and be bought and sold and retired.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's helpful,
Yeah, no.
overview.
But since you brought up the idea of doing the ground sampling to help sort of improve the understanding and algorithms over time, I have to bring up another thing, which is that I don't know if you saw, but Carbon Plan came out with a report today looking at all the projects that had applied to the Microsoft program and giving the various groups a rating in terms of confidence rating, and Regen Network wasn't among the higher ratings. And one of the concerns, I ended up talking to them.
I'll have to look at it. I haven't seen it.
So one of the concerns they raised is that there was only documentation for 2 of your 4 projects, and the 2 for the Australia site, the methodology stated you needed to be doing annual soil sampling at more than 20 sites for each project to assess the carbon uptake. And instead you had done 15 in total across both projects. Mm-hmm. So can you kind of help do you have a sense of what accounts for that discrepancy and why you would still be confident in the results regardless?
Yeah, and we went through a whole sort of process around this. So what happened in that instance is that there was a set of there was a sampling regime that had already happened, And we were using that sampling regime to sort of train and make an estimation. So we had created a methodology around what the optimal amount of samples were. And we were working with reality with a number of samples that had been created. And, that was communicated to all parties involved, that there was going to be a modification of the methodology, that, because you can't go back in time and do more samples. That's an impossibility. And so all parties are, sort of aware that there's a slightly less than optimal sample set, and that is going to have the following effects. And, the pedotransfer algorithms and all of the science points to pretty decent confidence in the outcome there. And it all falls within the thresholds of, carbon sequestration in similar climates. And this is where there's a dearth of, there's a whole very active conversation to have about this. There's not a lot of really good peer-reviewed science around, managed grazing, for instance. There is not a peer-reviewed soil organic carbon study for every land management practice in every ecoregion all across the globe. That doesn't exist. So in general, there are sort of like baselines in a few places. It's very sparse, right? So, what's important is to be sort of transparent and to be conservative about the amount of carbon. You estimated a certain amount of carbon and you set aside a big chunk of that. And there was a big chunk, there was 25% of the carbon that was monitored and quantified. 25% of that got set aside and said, in case of errors or in case of permanence losses, that carbon is going to, sort of be made whole. In addition to that, I would note, we're on the hook. If something were to happen, our business has to make Microsoft whole. So that's how confident we are. We're confident enough in the science backing that we sort of put our money where our mouth is, and we're happy to pay up if over time happens. And that's what's going to have to, it's just how it has to go. There's uncertainty. We're not claiming that it's perfect. We're claiming that we have a particular methodology that everybody knows we're running for the first time in order to try to create a new way of monitoring rangeland, which is, a huge amount of total land mass. It's in the earth, how we manage our rangeland, integrating trees into it, making sure that there's rotational grazing taking place. It's a giant carbon sink. And if it's managed poorly, it emits carbon every year. If it's managed well, it's either carbon neutral or it's carbon negative. Getting that exact precise quantification down is going to be an iterative process. We feel like we have it good enough to make transactions start to happen right now with some conservative buffer pools. And it will only get better as more and more people use methodologies, as more and more samples happen. And then, as it grows, we can get more precision and more accuracy, and we can create bigger buffer pools, and we can create more liquidity, and we can just sort of accelerate the whole process. So I think, that's the aim, really.
Okay. And I think Clea had a point that she wanted to raise related to these issues as well. So if we can let her speak here.
Yeah. Thanks, James, and thanks, Gregory. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to put a finer point on the measurement of soil carbon being particularly critical, and highlighting a very cool company that's kind of recently just come out. There was an article about them on TechCrunch called Yardstick, that essentially is developing a handheld device that can, instead of, I think, well, to your point, basically you need to, in order to be able to value the regenerative agriculture, or essentially increasing soil carbon uptake, you need to be able to measure it and monitor it. And satellite data is currently, I guess, not at the precision to be able to do that, but and I'm sure is getting there, and will be complemented by other tools. But essentially what Yardstick does is develop a handheld tool that combines that combines spectrometry and density calculation, or a density measurement, to calculate the amount of soil carbon, and combining that with some algorithms to extrapolate the amount of soil carbon sequestration that is taking place over a portion of land. And that's particularly exciting because the current methodology for doing that is usually extracting a portion of soil and doing some form of combustion on that to measure the carbon that's actually in there. And others, like Soil Carbon Company, are working on increasing the amount of carbon sequestration. So that in addition to, or instead of just more sustainable agricultural practices, is really key. It's kind of crazy to think that 45% of the Earth's soil is used for agriculture, and a lot of that is done in very unsustainable ways. So that's just that's a focus for lower carbon, and I just wanted to highlight that it's exciting to see more and more people work on that, because our soil can hold a lot of things, and carbon, a large amount of carbon can be one of them for sure.
Cool. And thanks for that additional point. I was hopelessly optimistic and thought I was going to get through 2 rounds of questions with everyone, but that was one. And we are about 15 minutes from the end. So I think at this point, I'm going to throw it over to Renee, who is going to bring up some questions from our audience.
Right. Just checking that you can hear me. Okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you, James, and thank you for the panel for throwing out a bunch of really interesting ideas and hard work that you're contributing. A couple of questions from the audience. This one I'm going to throw at Maddie. I have a question about the commercial opportunity of sequestration. Does carbon need to be sequestered forever, or for a minimum time to have value commercially?
When you say value commercially, I'm guessing this is in terms of selling to large corporations.
So I threw it to you. There's not more detail in the question, but I threw it to you because you've worked with Y Combinator, you've worked with consulting organizations. You've worked with Y Combinator and OpenAI. And so you deal with your own investors. So how do you answer the question of how long do you need to sequester carbon, whether it's in trees or other ways, for it to be viable?
I mean, I think it's a hard question to answer, right? And I think actually that Clea and other people would have interesting insights as well. I think, commercial viability, I think, is still a little bit opaque, right? You have projects that are being purchased by large corporations that are just delaying harvest for a year of timberland. Then you also have things like Charm Industrial, which is working on permanent sequestration forever. I think for living carbon, permanence is something that we think is incredibly important. And I would hope that we get to a place where we can account for 100-year permanence plus. Of course, that's, there are a lot of different things that we want to change, particularly around the bark thickness and decomposition rate, and just the ways in which you could be using wood for different products. I'm not totally sure on exactly the definition of the question here, but I think for us, we want people to get really excited about this idea of seeing trees as not only a means of capturing carbon, but also storing it for longer, and using the wood for viable products. So happy to let other people jump in here. Because I'm sure everyone has an opinion on this.
I think
question.
James wanted to add something to that. And I have questions for the other folks that kind of build on this.
I mean, I just wanted to add a note to this, because this is something that's come up in my own reporting and in people yelling at me on Twitter recently, which is that we've actually kind of reached, interestingly, a more sophisticated, I think we're getting into this more sophisticated place in the market, where what's happening is that people are pricing offsets and carbon removal in different ways based on the durability. So, at the far end, when we're talking about direct air capture and like literally storing this stuff permanently, turning it into stone and storing it underground, storing it for geological scales, that's the stuff that's $300 today. But what then you also on the other sides of the market, trees may be 100 years, soil maybe 25 years, but people are pricing it in different ways and saying, but if you have 4 of those, it adds up to 100 years worth of sequestration, but it may be only worth a quarter of the price. And so I think what's going to be really interesting to see is how the pricing ends up getting broken up. And I think also how companies respond to that, and whether, I mean, if you're a company and all you want to do is fix it on paper, you're going to buy $5 off, as many $5 offsets as you can. But if you're a company that's trying to do it in a more responsible way, like Stripe or Microsoft, I think they're going to look at that durability and consider it, that you have to pay a higher price if you want it to be considered permanent. Permanent, everyone's kind of defining as 100 years. If we haven't figured everything out by that point, then we have much bigger problems. But that's my take.
All right, that leads us into another audience question, which maybe Gregory and Landon can take a crack at, which is a question about these offset markets. Which sectors have the most opportunities and which have the most obstacles for the scale up of these climate mitigation outcomes? Basically, what is the role of offsets maybe 10 years from now?
It seems like there's sort of 2 questions. Like maybe one is a short term around the market opportunities that exist, and one is, are offsets going to be around in 10 years? Or will we have different instruments to do accounting and agreements about this? So I'll answer the second one first. I don't think offsets will be around in 10 years. I don't think it makes any sense the way that the legacy offset market works. It's sort of asking and answering kind of the wrong questions, really. We're getting to some of the right questions in this conversation. Storage, storage is important. Rate of sequestration, that's important. Those 2 things are really important. This sort of concept of additionality, has to be totally reinvented or abandoned, I think. And existing carbon markets rely on sort of strange ideas about additionality, which I think don't actually do us a lot of good in terms of the carbon markets. So and I'm happy to expand on that or debate on that. It's a very interesting topic, I think. In terms of my perspective about carbon markets right now, I think what you're going to see is I think the biggest opportunities, it's going to be a competition for charisma, really, at the end of the day. Like, people don't buy REDD+ avoided deforestation credits because of the carbon per se. They buy it because of the orangutans. They buy it because of the biodiversity. They buy it to protect the Amazon. The carbon is also nice. So I think this is why I sort of think, controversial hot take number 3 or whatever of the night for me, direct air capture is kind of absurd because you're creating a private good and you're asking people to pay for it as a public good. You're using a bunch of energy to pull carbon out of the atmosphere to turn it into carbon to sell people carbon. It's kind of absurd, really. What will win in the marketplace, I believe, of public goods, of people sort of like paying for public goods, are the ones that have the most co-benefits. How much flood risk is reduced? How healthy is the food that's produced out of this? What's the social benefit? What's the biodiversity benefit? All of these co-benefits are going to be the primary axes. And of course, the rigor of the verification. How confident are we? Those are the 2 primary axes, I think, of value, and innovation on those 2 fronts, I think, is going to be really fun over the short term until we sort of go beyond this, like the way offsets are working currently. And I'd love to hear Landon's take on this.
Yeah, I think you're touching on something really interesting around like charisma of projects. I think it's absolutely true. If you have a powerful story around a project, that's really an important part for a lot of people who want to buy carbon offsets. One other interesting thing, or from my perspective at least, I think there maybe is an interesting story around direct air capture, for instance. Like it's saying, look, we're humans and we've created this huge problem by burning fossil fuels. Like, let's capture those emissions, let's put it back in the ground. I think that's, on like a gut level, a compelling story to a lot of people. And I think a lot of other projects sort of fit in that bucket. I'd say also on where the carbon offset market is going. Like James was saying, there's a lot more sophistication around permanence. And I think only very recently has there been a good market for more permanent offsets that are at a much higher price. So like these Stripe paying hundreds of dollars per ton of CO2, that's very new. If people are willing to pay that much for really permanent removal that you can measure super well, I think there's a lot of opportunity on there. And even on REN, we get people just like regular individuals who say like, hey, I want to be supporting some of these projects. Like, how can I do that? And I could definitely see REN adding some more expensive projects that are offering something different, a little bit more permanence, and can really resonate with people in different ways sometimes.
All right, thank you. I have one more question that I'd like to pose to, particularly to Clea, but given the need, so this question about funding and the mechanisms for it, given the need to reduce circulating CO2, how do we unlock new money for such projects?
Is that from a, I guess, from an individual perspective or from an entrepreneur's perspective?
Well, you bring a lot of different hats to it as a scientist, as an investor, and yeah, the new mechanisms for funding these things. You clearly would struggle with that directly in the role that you now play. So you can answer it however you wish.
Well, I think for one, from the investor landscape, we're seeing more and more venture capital funds that weren't necessarily focused on climate change solutions get into this. I think increasingly they're also understanding that that a bet on negative emissions is essentially a bet on our humanity. So I think for a lot of them, they're coming to terms with that. So that's really exciting. I don't know if it's worth me naming some, but I mean also Y Combinator, obviously. I mean an accelerator program that has generally been focused on pure tech is now investing in a lot of. I think this current batch has I don't know how many, but it has several companies that are climate focused. A couple of which are in our portfolio that are very exciting and that are looking specifically on carbon removal or carbon sequestration broadly. I think Europe, I guess, already has a carbon market that's on the order of I think 1.3 billion tons of CO2. I guess what do you call it? CO2 credits that are being circulated. It's a very liquid market currently selling at the equivalent of 40 euros per ton of CO2. It's about $46 or $48. And I think that the expectation is that market is going to grow. From the US standpoint, if the audience doesn't already know, Carbon 180 is a great resource for generally R&D around the topic, but also in translating, in providing that communication between policy and entrepreneurs. And they have recently posted a blog that highlights all of the different funding mechanisms from the government that are related to carbon removal. And there's a lot. There's on the order of probably about 100 billion, if not more, spread out through different departments. You also have the DOE's RPI that is, if you haven't checked out their website, you should. There are a number of they're currently running their Open 2021 that have projects around carbon removal. So anyway, that's just to name a few, but it's definitely a space that's getting a lot more interest fast, and markets do already exist today. They're growing, and there is more government funding actually coming up, as well as private funding. So if you're not already working on this problem, please start now.
So thank you on behalf of the audience. Thank you for taking on these hard questions, both from the audience, but also the work that you're doing. I'll pass it over to the other organizers.
Sorry about that. Hi, everybody. I'm back, and on behalf of the entirety of the audience, which has hung in with us for the whole night and been paying close attention, just like I have, because this has been such a really engaging and fascinating talk. So On behalf of my fellow board members and the MIT Enterprise Forum of the Central Coast, I do want to thank all of our panelists and our guest moderator, James Temple, for sharing your evening with us.